Somaliland waxa ku mahmahdaa
walaadi nin bay dishaay in magasho
qofkii soo joogsan laga waayo soo jiifsaa laga helaa
marta ceelaliyo heshiiso ayaa reer maar cabaa
nabad baa naasal nuuga leh
nabadda diidaa waan ku turrantaana mooye
intay nabadi joogto ayaa nin waliba labani leegay
cidla waxa la seexdaa adiga cid ku maagayn cuntana waxay macaan tahay adigoo caafimaad qaba
sow godobi surinkaad martaba sabab qarsoon ma sow nabadi sahaydaada ood sidato umma
nabad haddaad haysato wax kaa maqani maba jiraan
Hargeisa, 1991. This is what's left after a decade-long civil war between the Somali National Movement and the Somali government forces. Hargeisa, 2007. A rapidly growing capital city of close to 500,000 people. The symbol of restored relations between communities affected by war. How were the people of Somaliland, a British protectorate until 1960, able to restore peace and stability? Equally important, how was a common political structure created in the face of such extremely difficult circumstances? This is a film that explores Somaliland's transition from active hostilities and war to peace and relative stability. The SNM was formed in London in April 1981 by a group of Isak intellectuals, professionals, and members of the country's armed forces. The movement established bases in Ethiopia in early 1982. However, it received very little other support from the Ethiopians, who were already backing another major Somali rebel group, the Somali Salvation Democratic Front. As a result, the SNM turned to clan elders and other traditional mechanisms for support.
The
elders came into this scene as a council the SNM founded. Initially, this wasn't a council for peacemaking. But the SNM rather founded this council as part and parcel of the movement, with the key role of mobilizing fighters, resources, and livestock. It was a council that was directly involved in the struggle.
We went to all of the subclans and asked them if they were willing to commit their weapons, livestock, and young men to the struggle. And they said they were willing. Then, as a delegation of nearly 500 men, we went to Farawene, where we inaugurated ourselves as the Gurti, because designating a special Gurti for specific missions is a strong Somali tradition.
As a measure to halt opposition, in subsequent years, Bari's authoritarian regime carried out a brutal repressive campaign, particularly against the Isak subclan, who provided the main base for the SNM, many of whom were subjected to arbitrary detentions, torture, and at times, execution. Cliques and rivalries for the movement's leadership were common within the SNM's top ranks from the very start.
The SNM was born with disagreements. These differences gradually intensified. But this is not unique to the SNM. It's quite common in anything that people try to work out together.
In a nation that would be known as Somaliland, these rivalries would later infuse chaos. But as insurgents out there in Ethiopian training camps, the enemy was one. The mission was one. So for the SNM, solidarity was essential. As an armed resistance, the SNM was engaged in guerrilla-style combat against the Somali government forces for 6 years. In early 1988, however, Somalia's Bare and Ethiopia's Mengistu agreed to a peace treaty that was intended to end support for armed resistance on both sides. Therefore, having decided to launch an all-out war on government forces, the SNM invaded major government bases in Hargeisa and Borao. In retaliation, the government combined the use of heavy artillery and bomber planes to flatten most of Hargeisa and Borao. In many ways, this war wasn't a traditional Somali conflict.
There are two key differences. The first one, of course, being the fact that the conflict was over a state and the power that comes with it, which were both considered as resources by the opposing sides, whereas traditionally, natural resources like water and grazing land were mostly the causes of conflict. The second difference is that traditionally, spears, swords, knives, bow and arrows were used by the opposing sides. But in the Somali Civil War, much more destructive weapons were used, of which the AK-47 was the smallest.
According to Africa Watch, over a 3-year period, an estimated 50,000 civilians were killed, while another 500,000 were displaced from their homes, with many fleeing to Ethiopia.
It wasn't just about the clan. It was really about the use of government power and resources against the interests and well-being of its own people, whereas in the old days, it was more of a clan-on-clan conflict.
It's 1991. The SNM was able to end the military regime of Siad Barre in the northern regions. The future looked uncertain. Non-Isaaq subclans were anxious to see what the triumphant and stronger SNM would now do. Some feared reprisals for supporting the defeated government.
It was a terribly worrying and emotionally intense period. All of the clans were in fear of each other. Naturally, everyone's biggest concern was revenge, and that was very intense.
The history of the Somali people is full of violent conflict and fierce confrontation. But whatever the source of the conflict or magnitude, it was always here, under the tranquility of a well-shaded tree, that elders patched up their differences, negotiated treaties, and cultivated peace.
Fortunately, the clans that were back in the SNM had already addressed this issue during their meetings prior to entering the country. They asked themselves what they would do if they ended up taking control of the country. They agreed that making peace with the other clans was the best thing for everybody. And so, they came into the country with that formula.
This was a prolonged war that had been going on for a while. All along during the conflict, structures and a kind of social order were taking form. These structures defined the roles of the different members of respective communities. It was this extensive conflict that had allowed the communities to mature and organize themselves when it came to making peace.
As it turned out, the SNM's long tradition of self-help and reliance on traditional mechanisms helped the movement to become accountable to a public.
The SNM took power as a relatively mature movement. And I think that understanding of political dynamics of the public, that interaction with other clans meant that the SNM was well aware that it could not govern, it couldn't lead, unless it was going to seek at least negotiate peace with the other clans in the territory.
Starting in Og and culminating in a decisive meeting in Berbera, the SNM took the first steps to end hostilities in the north through a series of local meetings and conferences between elders from all of the major Isaaq and non-Isaaq subclans. Remarkably, days before the collapse of Bari, northern clans were already engaged in dialogue. Formerly known as the Brotherhood Meeting of Northern Clans, the Berbera Conference was SNM sponsored. For the first time, delegations from all the clans of the then northern regions came together to collectively agree on an absolute ceasefire across the northern regions. Following this, starting in April 1991, all of the northern clans gathered in Borama with the intention of consolidating peace as well as discussing the political destiny of the northern regions with stronger emphasis on the representation and participation of all groups.
This is where, after the clan-based meetings concluded, the first National Assembly was held. Politicians, titled elders, and intellectuals from all of the clans from the north gathered here. This is where the resolutions and the declarations from the clans were transferred over to the SNM and its executive body for further discussions and approval.
The Borama meeting location was important because Borama was probably the best, most central place in a way, apart from the fact that Hargeisa was completely destroyed and full of mines. Borama was a place that also allowed the eastern clans to participate.
This was of particular concern because the defeat of the Somali army in the northern regions did not end hostilities in Sanag. Due to the diversity of its population, the conflict in the area was relatively more complicated than elsewhere in the northern regions. In fact, as members from the Harti subclans participated in the Borama conference, some villages out east were under attack.
Sanag region is first of all a front line inside Somaliland. At the same time, you have a diverse mixture of Isaac and Darod subclans and sub-lineages living inside the region. For centuries, these subclans and sub-lineages have lived there together. But it was the civil war and its conflict dynamics that divided these communities, where one clan group supported the government while the other backed the SNM.
Sanag region has unique characteristics that put its communities at a high risk of conflict. Because of their very close ties and the huge legacy of disputes there, their clashes can be the ugliest of clashes. But it is these same characteristics that make it possible for Sanag communities to resolve their problems in the best of ways.
As a result, a swift transition from war and hostility to peace wasn't immediately possible here. And for some time, this threatened to undermine Somaliland's peace processes. This then prompted both the elders and the SNM leaders to address Sanag as a priority area in the Borama conference.
In Borama, we all agreed to live peacefully among each other. We also agreed to reclaim Somaliland's sovereignty. As such, we agreed that all parties be given the opportunity to take part in the new government's different institutions. But at the time, the only organization that existed was the SNM. And since not all of the clans in the north were a part of it, we thought that it was important to incorporate these clans into the SNM's executive body and the national Gurti.
On May 18, 1991, the SNM Central Committee, supported by the elders representing all the major clans in the northern regions, declared the restoration of the Republic of Somaliland.
The issue of independence was contentious, even within the SNM. There were members of the movement that did have such feelings. But it was never our policy, and it certainly wasn't discussed out in the open. It was something that emerged after liberation. It was witnessing what the southern forces did to the people and their properties during the war that really contributed to its momentum.
To tell you the truth, declaring independence was the best thing to do right there and then. Because if it wasn't done that way, we would have had serious problems. And not between the Isaac and the others, but within the SNM itself. I think history should be told honestly. There was some pressure on the participants. Some militia groups came to the venue from Berbera with a huge local following. demanding that independence be declared. On the other hand, although I can't say for sure what their private feelings were, I didn't see anyone who was principally against the idea.
After declaration, a government was established for the Republic with Abdurrahman Ahmed as president and Hassan Issa Jama as vice president. With independence declared, everything looked up. The resumption of livestock exports meant relative economic growth. Restored sovereignty and a marked contrast to what was happening in the South led to a degree of stability. However, this would not last long.
The people that were returning to the country, whether they were returning refugees or fighters, did not have a community that had the capacity to absorb them. What I mean is, war-torn communities cannot absorb refugees and armed militias.
Everywhere stood young fighters, armed and with nothing to occupy them. The euphoria of the liberation slowly waned. In its place, the challenges of post-war reality began to take their toll on the goodwill of all.
Most liberation movements take much longer than we did to achieve their mission. Take, for example, Eritrea's liberation movement. Although we did share similarities, I can say that we were different in many ways. Nevertheless, we came into the country with a lot of loose ends and matters that should have been resolved while we were outside the country.
The long brewing rivalry over power between respective SNM factions suddenly found itself with full scope to boil over. Squabbles erupted quickly and escalated easily, breaking out into full-on conflict, first in Borama, then in Berbera.
I don't even think that the most resourceful government could have coped with such a reality on the ground, much less the first SNM government. The capacity of the government and the reality on the ground were completely disproportional. Nevertheless, the lack of unity within the SNM did worsen the situation. When once someone said to Tur, "Your government is too slow," his infamous answer was that he thought this was in their best interest, because if they went faster, they might trip over.
Reconciliation was difficult between warring SNM factions as well as between the government and opposition. Since, however, this was an inter-Isaaq conflict, the intervention of non-Isaaqs became necessary, which ironically seemed to strengthen the sense of nationhood among the various subclans. While both conflicts were essentially rooted in the ever-widening rift between the various factions within the SNM, in Berbera, a battle over the control of public property and revenue streams gradually emerged. The government was seemingly unable to contain the mounting tension. Lootings, shootings, and petty violence had all become frequent across the country.
The biggest need was law and order and the creation of an authority, a government that enforced the law, because armed bandits were running havoc in the country's towns and highways. All they cared about was raiding communities, and they made life difficult for everybody.
With no resolution in sight, there was consensus that it was time for the elders to mediate between fighting factions and between the government and opposition.
There had been some fighting between the respective subclans in the past, and here they were fighting again before the government's 2-year interim period had ended. This deeply affected Tur's government, and neither his parliament nor the ministerial cabinet were able to help calm the situation. So, he called all of the elders from the various subclans to a meeting and asked us to take over because he was resigning. We told him that we would do whatever we could to assist him in calming and improving the situation, but that we could not accept his resignation.
Fully mandated and with relative calm in place, the elders were able to travel across the country and facilitate a series of meetings that culminated in the Tawfiq meeting here in Sheikh.
The conflict was mainly between Isaq subclans, and so the need for intervention by a party that wasn't Isaq became necessary. And I think it was the fact that they were so neutral that made the intervention of non-Isaqs so effective. And God bless them, they did do a great job.
Meanwhile, in Sanag, communities were engaging in a series of small-scale meetings. Because of the complexity of the region's geographically influenced history, however, respective clans met in twos in order to resolve their differences and grudges individually, without the pressures of a broader conference.
The foundation of the peace in Sanag was the fact that for 2 years the communities came together in a series of meetings. The unique thing about this was that they met in twos at different venues. So each subclan was given the chance to deal with the little problems they had with the other in these separate meetings.
Women have made significant contributions to Somaliland's peace and nation-building processes.
At the height of the conflict in Sanag, one of the most important responsibilities taken up by the women of this region was bringing messages of peace from one side of the conflict to the other. This was especially helpful in getting the pastoralists to peacefully share resources like grazing and water. Women who were married into a clan different from their own were particularly effective in carrying messages of peace from their in-laws to their own clan, and also from their own clan to their in-laws. At that time, there were no telephones or radios, so women's role as peace messengers was very helpful in addition to their traditional responsibilities in peace-building efforts.
First of all, women are most of all peace lovers because they stand to benefit least from conflict and war. Women don't have a clan. They are born into one clan but get married into another. So when it's her family clan and her in-laws fighting, it's so difficult for her because on the one hand, it's her brothers that are dying, and on the other hand, it's her husband that's dying. So naturally, women work for peace and making sure conflict doesn't easily break out. This role includes mobilizing resources and funding and preparing the venue.
But nowhere was this role more visible than at the Tawfiq meeting in Sheikh. For the first time, women were able to exercise their right as stakeholders.
It seemed to most people that things weren't moving along fast enough. So, the local women decided to organize a huge rally from downtown all the way to the front entrance of the venue. They demanded that the peace treaty be immediately signed. Accordingly, they were allowed to sit and listen in on the proceedings and witness firsthand the signing of the agreement.
Timing was a crucial factor in the country's peace-building efforts. Some initiatives took place at a very early stage, where a lot of social barriers still existed. Later initiatives were built on the outcomes of previous missions that had helped to restore communication and relationships between everybody. I think it was this key factor that set apart the Sheikh meeting from the initiatives that preceded it. And it was also this factor that had allowed women to assume a greater role during the meeting in Sheikh.
By its conclusion, the Tawfiq meeting was able to successfully bring the Borama and Berbera conflicts to an end. Nationwide stability, however, remained largely fragile.
There was such a short period of time between the Borama and Berbera clashes that the consensus among the elders at the conference was that further violence could not be prevented unless we established a strong system to control the clans.
To undertake this, around 500 delegates from across the country gathered in and were hosted by the community of Borama.
The elders thought Borama would be the best venue for the conference as they were the most organized clan. We welcomed that idea, believing that it was our honor to host the people of Somaliland as they came together and discussed their future. Regardless of the number of delegates, we thought we were prepared enough to receive them, and our community was very happy about that.
Organized along clan lines, the Borama Conference was intended to address a range of topics with the stated purpose of deciding on the political destiny of Somaliland.
This is where in 1993 the Borama Conference was held. This is where Somaliland as a state was finally instituted.
There was much debate over what this destiny might cover, but eventually it was agreed that a security framework should be established before the debate shifted to national constitutional structure. Several proposals were put forward concerning the system of government. Negotiations were intense.
The intellectuals and politicians met over a period of 15 days. When they returned to us, they said we've come up with 3 different systems. One group was in favor of a president and vice president. Another group was in favor of a president and a prime minister, while the third proposed a rotating system of presidency. We said this was unacceptable and demanded that they go back and agree on a system.
After a lengthy deadlock, it was through intense negotiations and serious political bargaining that a system consisting of a strong executive president with the Council of Ministers and a parliament was agreed upon. Following this, in landmark elections, Mohammed Ibrahim Igal was elected president and Abdirahman Aw Ali Farah as vice president. A consensus was also secured on the formation of a parliament and an upper council of elders. In parallel, the Synod peace processes were drawing to a close. After more than 2 years of a series of cross-subclan meetings, all major subclans of Isaac and Darod came together in Aragabo.
When all Somaliland clans met in Borama, where a new president was elected and a new parliament instituted, many members from the Senag region got the chance to meet and discuss important issues. It was here that holding a grand conference in Aragabo was proposed.
It was here that hostilities were finally put to an end on a grand scale, and the restoration of all looted property to the rightful owners was agreed upon. Equally important, basic rules of living together were set here and stated in a regional peace charter, establishing relative stability and normal economic and social relations among the conflicting subclans. By its conclusion, the Borama Conference became another milestone on the road to Somaliland's recovery and reconstruction.
The conference's key outcomes included a national charter, a peace charter that dealt with the clans, and of course an administration that included an executive body, a parliament, and an upper council of elders. These were the most important outcomes.
The peace charter drafted at the Borama Conference dealt with security as a separate issue. This approach to security was in stark contrast to other peace and nation-building initiatives inside Somaliland as well as in other Somali regions. This separation of security from the political framework compelled clans and communities to take responsibility for the security of their own territories. Ultimately, though, it would be the conference's legacy of denying any single party to wield undue political influence that enabled the new administration to embark upon the ambitious task of demobilizing clan-based militias, an accomplishment that was vital to Somaliland's recovery and reconstruction.
Agreeing on a government was the easier part. But it wasn't until all of the clans gave it their allegiance that things really took off. And while in the old days a handshake symbolized allegiance, in our case the clans handed over their weapons to the government as a sign of their allegiance. And that's how they demonstrated that they accepted it and wanted to be a part of it.
The country's first civilian president, Mohammed Ibrahim Igal, was able to immediately set up an administration. Although enjoying broad support, the new administration brought no magical solutions to the process of institution building. This process continues to this day. Although it would take another 9 years for formal elections to take place, most people look back on the 3 peace and nation-building processes, Boro, Sanag, and Borama, as fundamentally important periods in the history of this country.
The Borama conference ended in style. It was 100% success because its core objectives were thoroughly reached. I mean, it was mainly about forgiveness between the clans that had supported the government and those that had supported the SNM, and living and letting live. And I don't think we've had any problems to that regard since.
Sanag is where so many clan borders meet, where so many different communities with different clan roots converge. So it became quite apparent to everyone that if things could be resolved there, then it can be done anywhere. And this is why making sure there was no more violence in Sanag was given such a priority. The secret to this was the people of Somaliland, who were thrilled to have a government of their own. It was the people of Somaliland who were ready to hand over their weapons for the greater good. It was the people of Somaliland who were ready to nationalize their militias so that no clan had its own private army.
If Somalis are left alone, they will resolve their differences. If Somalis are able to avoid the interference of others, they will solve their problems. And we have seen this. Somaliland is a good example. Representation is important. And so the delegates that participate in peace processes must be people that truly represent the communities. People who they believe and have confidence in. There was one great opportunity without which I think nothing would have been possible for Somaliland. This was the fact that we intentionally refused to allow any armed groups or individuals to participate in the Borama conference. This was because if armed groups attended the conference meetings alongside the elders, nothing would have gone right.
I think, first of all, if things are to work right, there must be a culture in which everyone is given the chance to be heard. Anyone who has some grievances must be given the opportunity to be heard, and there must be some sort of a mechanism with which problems are settled.
Many of the participants from Borama remember that when they arrived there, that it wasn't just a place to meet, that when they left the conference hall and they could go for tea, and they were welcomed by the inhabitants of the town, and they could chat with local people, and they had to find places to stay, and they were living in that community, that as well helped to heal some of the tensions of the civil war that had existed between the Gadabursi and the Isak. There was a real sense of peace being made through the interaction between the communities.
We say peace is like a small child. Small children are first born as infants, completely dependent on their mothers. The mother cares around the infant for a while. Then as it grows, the baby learns to crawl and starts to move about. Then the baby learns to stand up on its own 2 feet. So, we say that peace is like a small child that goes through all of those stages. And we think that the peace we have today has stood up on its own 2 feet.